So I'm in the middle of sewing up some curved piecing, some quadrants or Drunkard's Path blocks for my new sample of Bodacious Blossoms. I'm using Modern Quilt Studio's newest fabric line called Truly, coming out from Benetex Fabrics. It'll be out in shops very soon. And I thought it would be nice to show you how you actually pin and sew and press this curve when working on one of our Colourwerx patterns. I like to use the Clover quilting pins, which are number 2509. Super fine quilting pins. You get 100 pins, and what I like about them is I leave my pins in place along the curve, so I actually can sew right over the pins because they'll flex out of the way of the needle. So let's see how we would piece this curve and pin it up and get it ready for stitching. I've already cut my quadrant shape, which is a template shape in our pattern, from my Wonky pieced unit, and I've already cut my L shapes from the template shape that's included in the pattern. And the first thing I'm going to do is give them a press over like this to create a center crease in each shape. So I want to make sure I'm finding the center of each shape first. And then to kind of release the bias here, I'm just going to give it a little pull. Not too much, just a little pull there at either end to kind of release and stretch out that bias. And the same thing on this little Wonky piece unit, just give it a little pull. Place it back down in place, and we're going to place the L shape right sides together with the quadrant, line up those center creased marks, ensuring that the right hand corner here, or the square part of the shape, is parallel to the square part of the quadrant shape. And we'll put one pin right there in the middle, like so. And we're only going to do 3 pins. Now, you may find you need 5 pins, and that's okay. I like to do 3 pins. But the center pin is probably the most important because that means that we're directly in center of each shape, and then we're going to evenly distribute to either side these extra pieces of fabric. So I'm going to line up the edge of the L shape to the edge of the quadrant. I'm going to do like I normally do, which is kind of extend, if you can see that, the L shape just about 1/8 of an inch beyond the edge of the quadrant shape. That's because the L shape usually shrinks in more than the quadrant shape. And to pin this, again, I'm using my Clover extra fine quilting pins. I'm going to rock it twice, the pin, so that it's really, really secure there at the end. And I'm going to do the same thing on this side. I'm going to line up, extend just ever so slightly, take my pin and rock it twice. And there you go. We are set and ready to go. All of this excess fabric will ease in very nicely when I get it over to the sewing machine. So when you get ready to sew a curve, you're going to want to put a leader piece in, which is a scrap piece of fabric. Sew right through that scrap piece so it catches all your threads. This will make feeding this unit in go a lot easier. I am leaving my pins in place, so I'm using my 1/4 inch foot that does not have a guide to it. And you just want to take it not too fast, but not too slow. I'm just worried about matching the L shape and the quadrant edges together as they approach the needle. I'm not worried about anything happening behind me or in front of me. Just watch about a 1/2 inch before it goes under the needle, making sure that these edges are matching. I'm doing a scant 1/4 inch seam and going right over that pin again. That's the great thing about those pins. And I'm just going to come down the curve here, pulling a little bit if I need to, just releasing that bias again. If the fabric looks like it's going to pucker, just lift your presser foot and move it out of the way, or move it forward, if you will. And you can use tweezers here if you feel a little gun shy. I think you're going to sew over your fingers. Then use tweezers. That will make sure that you can get those edges really nicely together and matched on the edge before it hits the needle. And you sew right through, and we'll go back over and iron it. So I'm done with my stitching. I'm now going to remove the pins. And normally with Drunkard's Path blocks, you're going to press out towards the L shape. That's the easiest side that's the side of least resistance. The block tends to want to be pressed that way. And I just use the weight of my iron and the tip of my iron to kind of gently coach, if you will, that seam into place. I'm pulling on the L shape, so that it pulls out and the seam pulls away from the quadrant, so it doesn't have any of that, what I call like a rollover on the seam. Get it as flat as you can on this side. I'm using a little steam in my iron. And when you get it as flat as you can, bring it over to the right side and then start to really press out that quadrant flat and that seam flat. Now, you may find at times that as you're pressing, and this is just the nature of how the block goes together, that the outer edges of your block will start to shrink in, and you'll see like a veering in of the block, which will give you some problems when you're trying to square this down and trim it down. So go ahead and give it a little spray starch, like Maryland's Best Press or starch, and then get that iron back in there. You can even use a little water if you want, and just press that edge. I'm pulling on the L shape right here. Press it back out straight so that you can trim it down nicely under the square ruler and the cutting board. You may find some distortion of the fabric on the L shape, but quite frankly, most of that's going to get trimmed away. So just work it out so it becomes as square as it can, once you're done with this part. You need a little more starch on that side. It may look a little odd right now, but remember, we're trimming this down into the exact size we need. Now, the other thing that happens is there are times that you need to press the seam in the opposite direction, not towards the L shape, but towards the quadrant. And that becomes a little bit more challenging. And so what you need to do is just simply keep working on this seam. See how I'm pressing it? And I'm using the point of the iron to kind of gently coerce or coax that seam over towards the quadrant. This will take a little bit more time, a little bit more patience. You can't just lop the whole iron on there. Just use the tip, gently pulling on the quadrant as you iron to pull that seam towards the quadrant piece. So just use that, and then as soon as you can get it kind of flat like that, bring it to the front side now. Make sure that seam's going the way you want it to, and start to press out. I kind of slide my iron, which is against the rules, but I slide my iron down the block, if you will, and kind of move everything down towards the point here. And again, you might have that same problem where these edges are shrinking in. So just give it a little spray starch or water and pull on that edge and kind of bring them back out square as you can to the block itself, remembering we're trimming all this down when we get done. But that seam now is going in the opposite direction to its partner, which means when you put these two blocks together, it'll be really easy to match up these edges right here. So many times with our Colourwerx patterns, it's going to ask you to trim down the block to a certain size. On this Bodacious Blossoms one, it's 8.5 by 8.5. It differs from pattern to pattern, but many times we'll ask you to trim, leaving a 1/4 inch seam allowance of the L shape up here in the upper left and down here in the bottom right. And that's so when you're sewing blocks together with different blocks, you get a continuation of the curve. This will actually hide this little 1/4 inch part here of the L shape will actually end up hiding itself in the seam allowance when you sew block to block. And the curve will look like it's continuing around in a circle, or, that curves look like they're flowing in and out of each other. So to trim down these blocks to size, here I've got this one that I just sewed and pressed, and I'm going to trim this down to 8.5. But the very first thing I'm going to do is just ensure that I'm leaving my 1/4 inch seam allowance where I need to. So I'm lining up, because the block is being trimmed down to 8.5 by 8.5, I'm lining up the 8.25 inch mark of the ruler over the seam line that connects the L shape to the quadrant. So 8.25 up here and 8.25 here. That line of the ruler, that 8.25 inch mark, is lined up directly over the seam line that connects the L shape to the quadrant. And you can see I'm not going to take much off at all, if anything. It's just going to be a hair or just threads off. It's just to clean up that line. And now that I've done that, I'm going to rotate the block 180 degrees, and you'll find that most of the trimming is going to come off the L shape itself. So we're going to put the 8.5 inch lines now of the ruler on the clean edges we just cut. And then the rest of this blue fabric or L-shaped fabric that is left is going to get cut off, anything that exceeds the ruler. So up the right side, across over the top, being careful not to have the ruler slip. And you can see what I have left there is a perfect 8.5 by 8.5 inch drunkard's path block. But more importantly, I've left a 1/4 inch up here at the very tip here of the L shape and the very tip over here of the L shape, these outer tips, that's a 1/4 inch, so that when I sew this block to another block, it will seamlessly look like a perfect circle, or that quadrants are moving in and out of each other. And that's how you do it. So happy curvaceous quilting, everybody.